Welcome. My name is Henry Matthews. I'm the Director of Galleries and Collections at Grand Valley State University. I'm very happy to see you here today. Thank you for coming out. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ellen Adams, Dr. Adams, who is a professor in the Honors College, a professor of art history. Do I have that right? I think so. And but she is also assigned to the art gallery for a part of her workload. So we are thrilled to have her because she writes articles for us, she does research, she brings students in, she makes them aware of the collections and how to use it. So we're just thrilled to have Ellen on our team as well. And so without further ado, she's going to talk today about Matthias Alten. What a surprise. Want to come tell us about it? Thank you, Dr. Ellen Adams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out on an evening that sort of feels like spring, a little bit. Are we there yet? And thank you, Henry, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? We good? Okay. I'm excited to be back here speaking with you about the work of Matthias Alten, whose paintings I've thought about for a long time now. And I'd actually like to start with a little bit of visualization. So what I'm going to ask you to do is close your eyes for a moment. I'm serious, close your eyes. Everybody close your eyes. And don't fall asleep on me yet. Okay, all right. So close your eyes for a moment and picture an artist alone in the studio. Visualize everything, the tools, the smell of oil paint or clay, works of art on an easel or work table, maybe even cigarette smoke hanging heavily in the air. How do you picture the artistic process? If you've seen movies about artists or poets or writers or musicians, often the process goes something like this. Cue the dramatic music. A brooding artist paces around the studio frantically searching for ideas, when all of a sudden, bam, like a lightning bolt, the inspiration hits and our artist, in a fury of activity, transfers the contents of the artistic brain directly onto the surface of a canvas. And voila, a masterpiece is born. You can open your eyes now. Now, for those of us who know artists, or maybe have even attempted to be artists ourselves, we can recognize in this romantic tableau a mythology that surrounds the artistic process and artists themselves. And this mythology can be countered by the examination of the career and interests of Matthias Alten. Alten had a long and successful career as a practicing artist, no small feat in early 20th century Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was an art teacher with an active studio, a portraitist who was paid by a wide variety of sitters, and a painter who sold his work through the commercial art market. An artist in the way that we probably understand the term. And although it would seem like the identity of the artist would be a fixed position, in fact, for centuries, the label artist was a malleable term. Historically considered akin to craftspeople, that is, woodworkers, stonemasons, and other people who worked with their hands and whose names are largely lost to us, artists around the turn of the first millennium, like those who lent their talents to buildings such as the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, those artists around that time began signing their work, which was an act of self-consciousness that blossomed during the humanist turn that led to the Renaissance. Since that time, artists have grappled with their position in society, how to classify the work that they do, and in essence, how to shape their identity as an artist. Now, this is kind of a fun example that I like to use with my students. So I'm showing you a letter by Leonardo da Vinci in his little handwriting. And this is an application letter to Duke Ludovico Sforza, who was the de facto ruler of Milan and the patron for the Last Supper. So in this letter, Leonardo wrote to Sforza about his seemingly endless engineering talents by way of a 10-point list. Bridge building, fortress bombardment, armored vehicle and catapult design, even the construction of a large bronze horse, the study of which you can see on the right, all to proclaim Sforza's immortal glory. Interestingly, his artistic genius is hinted at merely only towards the very end, almost as an afterthought. And he says, oh yeah, I can also make art for you, right? Just the Last Supper. On the simplest level then, and with a few exceptions, Leonardo and other artists during the Renaissance and later were essentially employees working for wealthy patrons. From the late 19th century on, however, artists largely moved within a commercial art world, one that significantly shifted the kinds of artwork produced. Matthias Alten's conception of the artist was shaped by the history of art, as well as his own milieu. The artist, who began his career as a craftsman in the furniture trade, was fully aware of the way in which societal expectations and experiences largely constructed modern artistic identity. Responding to an interviewer's question in the 1920s, the artist commented on the changing ideas about the type of person who would become an artist. And I'm quoting from Alten here. There is more interest in artwork today than ever before. All the classes and schools are crowded. It is because when our boys went abroad for the war, they got a new idea of art as a profession. They realized that it is the career of the strong man and woman. It used to be that when a boy or girl wasn't strong and wasn't worth much in any way, that they made an artist out of him, end quote. In fact, economic growth gave many Americans the money to buy art for their homes for the first time, which allowed more painters, sculptors, and photographers to make their living as artists. Interest in the arts expanded, as evidenced by the 60 new museums that opened during the decade of the 1920s in the United States, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, which opened in 1929. And just for reference, the Grand Rapids Art Gallery, which is now known as Graham, opened in 1910. Alten's comments then reflected a larger transformation of the role of art in the United States in the 1920s. So look at in the 1920s and beyond. So looking at Alten's self-portrait, Myself at 66, made me wonder about this shift. Few genres of artwork speak more to the construction of artistic identity than the self-portrait, either written in the form of a memoir or painted. Throughout my scholarly career, going way back to when I was a master's student, I've been fascinated with artists' self-portraits. I'm particularly keen on the juxtaposition of these two self-portraits, each done in the last year of Alten's life, and which couldn't be more different. Now, I have to tell you that I have obviously seen in person Myself at 66. I have not seen the other self-portrait. This is a self-portrait that I had found when I was looking at the Catalogue Raisonné online. So my discussion of these paintings is a little bit skewed towards Myself at 66 since I've actually seen it in person. Okay, so they couldn't be more different. So both portraits purport to show Alten as an artist in his home studio on Fulton Street in Grand Rapids, and both contain recognizable signifiers of artistic practice. The paintbrush, the materials of painting. So in the self-portrait on the left, you see a tiny little sliver of canvas in the upper right corner. And he's holding a little rag with which he wipes off the canvas in his hands and his brushes. And on the left, you have that paint-strewn palette, and he's holding brushes, right? So he has all of the accoutrement of a practicing artist. So what I will call the workman self-portrait on the left shows the aging artist against an open window with his brush held aloft. He gazes out at the audience, actively painting, presumably, the painting that we now view. Alten's last self-portrait, which is on the right, showing himself as what I consider to be a gentleman painter, has always struck me as an important image of the artist. Myself at 66 is a sizable canvas in which the artist gazes out at the viewer purposefully over his spectacles. We see a confident and seemingly forthright artist in his milieu with other paintings situated in the background, and it's that little sliver of the canvas on the right. The predominant color scheme of this painting is a kind of bluish gray, which comprises the majority of the shallow background, the artist's trousers, and it even permeates his wavy hair. Starkly contrasting this surrounding cool gray-blue are three central elements: the very proper bright white dress shirt, a carefully knotted red striped tie, and held under his right arm, a large palette full of colors. Now, both of these reflective studies, and they're executed with the aid of a mirror, he's looking at the mirror and painting what he sees, reveal much about the artist and what he, and in this case I'll use the gender pronoun appropriate to our topic, what he wishes the viewer to understand about his physiognomy, his working methods, his personality, and what I will call his station in life. I'm curious about his own artistic identity, insofar as he created not one, but two paintings of himself in the act of painting, one of which declares his age. I have several questions that I'd like to explore this evening through the lens of these two paintings. While there are approximately 30 identified self-portraits by the artist, only 4 show him painting, and half of these were created in the last year of his life, the 2 that I'm showing on the screen. The others date from 1926 and 1935. Could these hint at the artist in his twilight years, taking stock of his career, his life's work? A life in which his painting interests, I might add, and this will come into play in a few moments, his painting interests were devoted in large part to workers in all kinds of fields. To what extent, if any, does his approach to these paintings connect with his paintings of workers? Also, the workman self-portrait on the left is straightforwardly in medias res. That is, we see the artist in the midst of painting. He wears a smock-like garment to protect his shirt, vest, and tie. Having just wiped his hand or his brush, he holds the paint-marked cloth in his hand, and his brush appears to touch the surface of the canvas. The other, the gentleman painter, he simply sizes up his next composition, or maybe the viewer, with a tool in one hand and a bunch of clean brushes in the other. Could these representations represent two sides of Alton? A self-portrait presents the viewer with a vexing situation. Understandably, as I've just mentioned, the self-portrait is an argument, a construction of what the artist wants us to know or believe about himself. As the art historian Carrie Barrett notes, however, portraits can depict more than a single reality, a specific time and place, and a unique person. So we gaze at these portraits, people looking at people, transfixed by the need to enhance our knowledge of the sitters, seeking out traits that tell us something about the individual, but also something about the past. The danger inherent in this process involves taking historical and cultural information and then searching for that information in the portrait. Reading portraits then, which is what I'm going to do this evening, is a historically bound act that begins with the image and moves outward from the formal evidence. Really seeing a likeness in a historical portrait requires intense observation followed by learning about the subject, in this case, the artist. Now, these are two examples that I really like to use in my classes, and I always put them up there, and I ask my students what they tell us about the artist, her or himself. With the Judith Leister portrait, this is one of my absolute favorite pictures from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's a lovely painting. And I asked my students about the painter, right? So in the 17th century, in 17th century Holland, we have the development of a rudimentary commercial art market, right? And so Judith Leister, this is the first time that female painters can actually make a living as an artist. And I say, what does this portrait tell us about this woman? And they get around to saying, well, she's a figure painter. You can see it on her canvas. And I say, okay, so tell me more about what she looks like. Well, she's looking at us. She seems very friendly. She seems this and that. And I say, okay, let's think about what she's wearing. And I don't know if we can dim the lights a little bit on the screen, but Leister wears an amazingly elaborate costume, right? This was the absolute height of fashion in 17th century Holland. She wears a tight velvet bodice. She's wearing a wide satin skirt. And she's wearing this impossibly rigid collar that would have had to been cared for by a very attentive servant, right? So the image of the artist that we get from Leicester is that she is extremely successful and that she's quite wealthy. On the other hand, if we look at the Van Gogh painting, this is a later self-portrait. He used his own image in many, many, many instances, probably because he was the cheapest model around. But he's showing us as a painter, right? He's wearing that blue smock. He is in sort of with a nondescript background. He is focused on that canvas that he's working on. So these are two very different images that these artists are projecting. And I'd like us to keep this in mind as we think about Alton's work this evening. So, by all accounts, Matthias Alton worked extremely hard. Commentators on the artist often noted his admirable work ethic and his prodigious output. Quote, "Alton is a rapid worker, one of the most prolific of the present American list. This was always a quality of his work, but it is more pronounced more than ever," noted a writer for the Grand Rapids Herald in 1911. Recognizing the mythology surrounding artists and their muses, the writer continues, "Let it be said, though, that if Alton works when the mood is on, it comes often, or he must have a secret means of wooing it. For he, quite unlike many of his brothers who sit moodily in the studio waiting for the inspiration to arrive, goes forth boldly to meet it on the road." End quote. The same writer recounts the dizzying experience of visiting the artist's studio, where he was confronted with, quote, "a bewildering array of paintings, in the face of which he could do little more than gasp at the wealth of canvas confronting him." So he's completely overwhelmed not only by the output, but also this sort of huge numbers of paintings that he sees in the studio. Alton appreciated the quality of a strong work ethic in others, which might help to explain his interest in depicting laborers as much as he did. For example, he empathized with studio models for whom the physical and mental toll of posing for life classes was at best misunderstood and at worst judged to be disreputable. The artist defended them, explaining, "If people would only realize that the model must stand 45 minutes in a difficult position without moving, in a hot and stuffy room, they would understand that the only feeling of the class toward the model is pity and sympathy. She has to be watched constantly for any time she may faint dead away from exhaustion. The models I have are nice girls. They certainly work hard for their money. If they wanted to be immoral, there would be many easier ways of taking care of themselves. This is the hardest work there is for them. It is narrow-minded and foolish for people who know nothing of art to criticize the models." Models and other sitters proved central to Alton's work, and he took great care of their treatment and their comfort. Most of Alton's images of workers adhere to types rather than individual portraits. Take, for example, Clam Digger and Hauling the Boulder, both of which are from around 1910, 1911. Alton composes these paintings to emphasize and celebrate the men performing taxing work, but he also resists any hint of idealization or specificity. In the Clam Digger, the solid digger, while not monumentalized, nonetheless represents the only form to pierce the solid horizon line. Repeating a movement he has no doubt executed hundreds of times, the man stoops over to pull an old bag from the wicker basket, quote, "just as the old fellow looks and acts every day of his life," noted one reviewer. His curved back, gnarled hands, sunburnt nose, and graying hair and beard communicate years of labor. Alton closely connects the worker to the tools of his trade, the cart and the wicker basket, through shape. His hunched back echoes the round wheel and basket. Alton also uses this technique to suggest unity between a worker and his toils in hauling the boulder, which addresses the backbreaking labor of moving a heavy load using horsepower. Set against an early morning sky and landscape, we see a man bending low to secure his payload before hitching up his horses to hoist it away. Looking carefully at the colors and the shapes that the artist employs, we see that the rounded boulder, mottled grays with a slash of white and blue paint that serves as its highlight, that boulder echoes the shape and color of the worker's pose and clothing. His bowed back, the gray color of his vest, and even the shape of the vest's sash bear similarities to the large rock. In these paintings, the workers are not individualized, but they become physical signifiers of the work that they execute. Several of Alton's paintings of workers, however, captured more of the character and the personality of the sitter. This can be seen, for example, in his early work, Shoeshine Boy, from 1900, when he was exploring realism, much like the American painter Robert Henri, whose portrait, Dutch Girl Laughing, is also on the screen. Henri, a founding member of the Ashcan School, favored depicting denizens of urban life, that is, the lower classes, who were usually ignored by the official art academy. Alton's treatment of the Shoeshine Boy also differs from academic salon portraits, several of which are in the GVSU collection. The models in the present works were placed within dark defined spaces and treated with a somber palette. The only props in the Alton piece are the shoeshine box, on which the small boy sits, and the white work bag strapped across his shoulder. Both images present a sympathetic portrayal of their sitters. Alton worked quickly and directly in order to capture not only the boy's likeness, but also his station in life. Now, I'm not suggesting that Alton, like Henri and others, was concerned with or cognizant of the turn-of-the-century struggles between wage laborers and their employers that resulted in widespread strikes in urban areas, including Detroit. My concern here, rather, is with Alton's compassionate and personalized treatment of this young worker. He is not a type, but rather, with a few brushstrokes, Alton conveys that he's an individual. Returning to the two self-portraits, we see that Alton seems to combine these two approaches, adhering to types of artist self-portraits while maintaining a clear-eyed, non-idealized, but personalized view of himself. In the Workman self-portrait on the left, Alton is fairly straightforward in his treatment of himself as a painter. This looks like a working studio, and the artist appears in painter's garb caught in the act of painting. But why do I call the Alton in Myself at 66 a gentleman painter? Little has been written on Myself at 66, which presents me with a great opportunity. The playing field is wide open. So here we go. In the Grand Rapids Art Museum exhibition catalog for Matthias Alton, Journey of an American Painter, William Gertz wrote of the artist's last years and his returned attention to self-portraiture as, quote, challenges to both formal and psychological interpretations, end quote. Gertz characterizes Myself at 66 as characteristically vigorous and witty. And it is both of those things. But I'm going to suggest that it's in part a commentary on the artist's success as an artist and his skill as a painter. To justify my classification of this self-portrait as a gentleman painter, I'm going to focus for a short time on the frightening proximity of his crisp white shirt and his paint-smeared palette. Now, it's not the white formal or dress shirt per se that makes me regard this self-portrait a bit differently. Archival photographs of the artist indicate that he commonly wore white shirts while he was painting, both outside of the studio, on plein air or directly in nature, as we see in the photograph on the top left, and inside the studio, as you see in the earlier picture on the bottom left. The one on the top is from the 1930s, and the one on the bottom is from around 1910, 1911. While the white shirt is a seemingly banal topic, ubiquitous, perhaps even in this audience, and I see all of the men, most of the men wearing white shirts, a lot of you, the history of this garment proves to be fascinating. Oh, except for you, yeah. As the most common shirt color, the white shirt historically dominated the menswear scene and was initially the only choice for a gentleman. The archetypal men's white formal shirt has a natural fit for the upper body, a center front button opening with a collar, cuffs, long set-in sleeves, and a curved hemline. The lack of color on a man's collar and cuffs signified in the early 1900s when we're talking about, that this man, the man wearing it, did not have to do dirty work. For a time, colored dress shirts were looked upon with suspicion, since it was assumed that they were colored to hide stains. And there is, in fact, a self-portrait of Alton from 1935 that shows him painting with a blue shirt. This class of item of men's apparel is readily recognized within Western society and worn by diverse cultural groups. In fact, as one fashion scholar notes, this garment has had enormous social impact over the last, say, century and a half, and has been connected to social reform, class structures, status and power, gender ideals, and norms of dress. So it's more than just a background element of this painting. I'd like to focus a bit more narrowly on the cuff with its prominent cuff link, and you'll see that there. By the second decade of the 20th century, the production of men's dress shirts had shifted from the individually fitted and bespoke or tailor-made to factory-made garments comprised of cotton fabric. I had an example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's terrific Costume Institute, and it showed a shirt that had been made for Lord & Taylor around 1940, and it looks pretty much like the kind of shirts that all of you are wearing today. With the change in the factory production of the shirts, the cuff design had also changed, and the cuff design shifted from the French or double cuff, which requires cuff links and ideally a second set of hands to attach, to a barrel cuff, which is what most of you are wearing, with either one or two buttons. Mass-produced dress shirts with a barrel cuff became the most popular everyday style among men in the 1920s and 30s, owing in large part to advertising campaigns from various producers. And if you ever heard of the company Arrow, the shirt maker Arrow, they're still manufactured, and it constituted one of the more visible campaigns. In fact, the Arrow Man was a kind of archetypal advertising figure in the 1920s and 30s. And they remain the most common dress shirt today. Now, full disclosure, I do not know the actual content of Alton's closet, so I cannot tell you whether he wore French cuffed or barrel cuffed shirts on an everyday basis. And it's hard to tell in most of his portraits. He wears a French cuff here. What I am sure of is at this time and in this context, French cuffs like the ones worn by Alton in this painting would have been understood to be reserved for formal or evening wear, the kind worn by non-working class men. The message communicated by this self-portrait then, like the painting by Judith Leister in the 17th century, is this. We're looking at an artist who is foregrounding both his painting prowess and his success. And you can see that not only through the cuff, but also through that proximity of that huge palette with his white shirt, right? He's not actually painting anything. He's merely sort of showing it off. At this point in his career, Matthias Alton produced two self-portraits that commented specifically on his artistic legacy. As I've noted, the term artist was indeed malleable, and Alton constructed his self-image quite carefully. He self-consciously chose to portray himself in two ways, as a working man and as a gentleman. And after a long and successful career, it seems to be a reasonable conclusion to make. Thank you. Sure, I'll take questions. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them. Is anybody wearing French cuffs? They're quite challenging, right?
There is if I could just share a funny story about our portrait on the right, is that we have those brushes in the collection. And as you may know, they were given to us by Gloria Alton Gregory, and Gloria thought that the best thing to do before she gave us the brushes was, of course, this woman of Dutch background, seeing them. And so we have sparkling brushes. And the same is true of the palette.
The same is true of the palette.
Yes, yes, scrub thing.
You know what I think is interesting about, one of the things that I find interesting about this picture is that the brushes are clean in this picture. The brushes are, he's not using them. He's merely holding them as props. He's holding them up. And I have to think that that palette was also comprised of dried paint. You know, I don't think that there's, obviously, you can't be holding the palette that close to his shirt. But yet, he includes it in the picture. So he's saying, I'm a painter, and this is what. So
you talked about sort of this gentleman portrait. I'm curious what you think about the fact that he's jacket up so many of his other portraits. He's wearing a jacket. He looks more formal. And so this...
Or a vest.
Or a vest, right. So this sort of feels informal, right? He's sort of dressing down.
Well, I would agree with that. He does still have his very tightly knotted tie. He does have the dapper watch chain, with very lovely trousers with the belt. I think he sort of has all of those things. He's sort of jauntily smoking that cigarette, though. You know. No, it's a good point. I think that in those, you know, there were different messages to be communicated. He doesn't show himself actually painting in those paintings. So
I think the coupling should be an important clue to the formality.
I think so too. And I mean, they're very crisply ironed and pressed there. Yeah. You know, there are so many different approaches for artists, and it would all depend on the specific artist. And I'm trying to think of somebody in the 1930s. I mean, 1937, when he's working in the United States, of course, this was at the height of the fine arts project of the WPA. And so artists weren't necessarily showing themselves. They were very interested in sort of turning the lens outward and looking at the various populations that they were assigned to paint and photograph. And just trying to think of self-portraits at that time. I can think of portraiture, and portraiture was fairly formal in the 1920s. Let me think about some examples for you. You know, artists show themselves in all different ways. I mean, I'm thinking of Rembrandt's self-portraits, where some of them he looks like a rogue, and some of them he looks like he adopts the name of Hamlet, and others he shows himself as a painter. I mean, I think that it all depends on the artist and the time. A painter that I did look at, that I have looked at pretty extensively, who used self-portraiture as a kind of construct, used it as a way to construct his artistic stuff, is Max Beckmann, who was working in Germany in the 1920s and then emigrated to the United States in the 1930s. And he showed himself in all different guises. He showed himself as a harlequin, he showed himself as in a tuxedo, smoking a cigarette, showed himself as kind of a very sexualized man. So it all depends on the artist and the time. I just found that these two portraits, they just seem very calculated, that he's thinking about his position at the end of her career. And not that he knew it was them, but they were his last, so among his last paintings.
Well, I've been interested in the finances. He had somebody who was working and traveling all over the world with a family. I know you always think of artists as starving to death, but he apparently wasn't.
You know, I'm not going to say, I say this in the best possible way, he hustled, right? He was a teacher, he did portraits for money. As I said, he participated in the commercial art market. It seemed to me, you know, he had, his wife's family owned a business, but I don't think that was a hugely lucrative prospect. So he made his money. And
And I think that he was at certain times more prosperous than others. But he didn't have a specific patron, if that's what you're asking. There wasn't somebody who was sort of paying his bills every month. There wasn't a gallery that was representing him specifically who would give, to my mind, I don't know that there was, that gave him a stipend each month, right? So he was a very hardworking man. That's an interesting question. Anything else? Thank you.
So ladies and gentlemen, thank you.